Welcome to the Grains section of the new meal pattern requirements. Let's begin with a basic overview of the requirements for grains. There are daily minimums for grains offered. There are also weekly minimums and weekly maximums for grains offered. To determine portion sizes this year, school year 2012-2013, you can continue to use Exhibit A from the Food Buying Guide. However, effective school year 2013-2014, you will have to use a new Exhibit A. Exhibit A can be found on Pairs Form download. Another requirement for grains is that half of the grains that are offered each week must be whole grain rich. This will be explained later in the presentation. No more than 2 grain-based desserts may be offered at lunch per week. There are no changes to grain requirements for breakfast for school year 2012-2013. Here's an example of how grain products of various weights may be credited in school year 2012-2013 and in school year 2013-2014 using Exhibit A. You'll see that in 2012-2013, a whole grain hot dog roll would be credited as 1 3/4 grains, and in school year 2013-2014, that same grain will be credited as 1 1/2 grains. This slide shows the grain requirements for each grade group. The chart shows the weekly minimum and maximum number of grains for each group, followed in parentheses by the daily minimum. So, for grades K to 5, the weekly minimum is 8, the weekly maximum is 9, and the daily minimum is 1 grain. For grades 6 through 8, the weekly minimum is 8, the weekly maximum is 10, and the daily minimum is 1 grain. For grades 9 through 12, the weekly minimum is 10, the weekly maximum is 12, and the daily minimum is 2 grains. How will this work if you offer several options for reimbursable meals that contain different grain equivalents? Determine the number of grains offered with each reimbursable meal that the child can choose each day. The meal with the fewest grains has your daily minimum. The meal with the most grains has your daily maximum. For example, if you're offering a hamburger on a whole grain roll, which is 2 grains, as one option, and a turkey wrap, which is 1 1/4 grains, as another option, your daily minimum would be 1 1/4 and your daily maximum would be 2 grains. To calculate your weekly minimum, add up your minimums for each day. So, you add up minimums from Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday to get your weekly minimum. To get your weekly maximum, add up the maximums for each day. There is some additional information on this in USDA Memo SP 10-2012 on page 20 and 21, but we will also follow with some more examples. In this example, 2 meal choices are offered each day in a K to 5 school. The first meal offers 1 grain and the second meal has 2 grains. The daily minimum for grains for each day is 1 and the daily maximum for each day is 2. To calculate the weekly minimum, add up the daily minimums, which equals 5 grains. To calculate the weekly maximum, add up the daily maximums, which equals 10 grains. Since the weekly minimum in this example is 5, it does not meet the weekly minimum requirement of 8 grains. Since the weekly maximum in this example is 10 grains, it exceeds the weekly maximum of 9 grains. Here's another example, which is also a K to 5 school. If you add up the minimum choices for each day, the total is 8 grains. If you add the maximums for each day, the total is also 8 grains. In this example, the daily minimum requirement of 1 grain is met. The weekly range of 8 to 9 grains is also met. This last example shows a menu for grades 6 to 8. On Monday, they offer a hamburger on the whole grain roll, which is 2 grains, and a turkey wrap, which is 2 grains, so the minimum is 2 and the maximum is 2. On Tuesday, they offer grilled chicken with a dinner roll, which is 1 3/4 grains, and peanut butter on whole wheat bread, which is 2 grains. We will not review each day separately, but you can see on the chart if you add up the daily minimums, you get a weekly minimum of 8 1/4. If you add up the daily maximums, you get a weekly maximum of 10. Many schools serve breaded chicken patties and breaded fish. Does the breading count toward the grain requirement? During school year 2012-2013, it is your choice. You can count the breading, but you are not required to count it as part of your maximum. But school year 2013-2014 and after, the grain on products which are breaded or battered will have to count toward the weekly grain requirement. Some schools have weeks that are fewer than 5 days or more than 5 days on a regular basis. An example is an RCCI with a 7-day week. The grain requirements are different for these schools. These do not apply to schools that normally serve lunch 5 days a week but have occasional days off for reasons such as holidays or snow days. For schools that have short weeks, less than 5 days on a regular basis, the weekly quantity is reduced by about 20% or 1/5 for each day less than 5. For schools that have long weeks, more than 5 days on a regular basis, the weekly quantity is increased by about 20% or 1/5 for each day greater than 5. You don't have to do these calculations on your own. There is a chart in pairs form download which shows the requirements for schools that regularly have short or long weeks. Here is a sample of the information in that chart for grades K to 5. 8 to 9 grains is the weekly requirement for a 5-day week for grades K to 5. As the week gets shorter, the required number of grains decreases. As the week gets longer, the required number increases. Next, we're going to discuss whole grains. Effective school year 2012-2013, half the grains offered during the school week must meet the whole grain rich criteria. Whole grain rich criteria means that at least 50% of the grain weight in the product is whole grain, and any other grains in the product must be enriched. Some examples of more familiar whole grains include whole wheat, whole corn, whole oats, whole rye, whole barley, brown rice, wild rice, oatmeal, rolled oats, cracked wheat, crushed wheat, entire wheat, wheat berries, groats, and graham flour. Additional examples of whole grains can be found on the Healthier U.S. School Challenge website. Examples of grains that are not whole grains include flour, white flour, and wheat flour, unbleached flour, enriched flour, bread flour, cake flour, and durum flour, corn grits, farina, semolina, and degerminated cornmeal. There are some ingredients that may or may not be whole grain. For example, stone ground wheat may be stone ground whole wheat or stone ground wheat that is not whole grain. If you see the ingredient corn, oats, or rye listed on a label without a whole grain descriptor in front of it, you may not be able to tell if these are whole grains or not. The term multigrain on a label usually means that there are several different grains in the product, but doesn't necessarily mean that they are whole grains. In these cases, you would need to get more information from the manufacturer to determine if they are whole grains. How do you identify whole grain rich foods? There are 2 requirements that must be met. The first is that the product must meet the portion size requirements in Exhibit A. In addition, the product must meet at least one of the criteria listed on this slide. The first ingredient is a whole grain, or the first ingredient is water and the second ingredient is a whole grain. For example, if the first ingredient is whole grain wheat or whole corn, it meets the criteria. Or if the first ingredient is water and the second ingredient is whole wheat or whole corn, it meets the criteria. For a mixed dish such as a pizza or a taco, the first grain ingredient is a whole grain. For example, if pizza ingredients are cheese, milk, tomato sauce, then whole wheat flour, it meets the criteria. The product contains at least 8 grams of whole grain per serving. This can be determined by contacting the manufacturer or possibly looking for this information on a whole grain stamp or other part of the label. A picture of a whole grain stamp is on the next slide. The label includes the Food and Drug Administration Whole Grain Health Claim. This claim is listed on a future slide. Keep in mind that use of this claim is optional. Not all whole grain products will include this claim. A recipe or manufacturer documentation verifies the whole grain weight is more than the non-whole grain weight. For example, if you have a recipe for bread with 16 ounces of whole wheat flour and 14 ounces of enriched flour, then it meets this criteria. This whole grain stamp may be on whole grain rich products. Keep in mind that this stamp is not required on whole grain items, so not all whole grain rich items will have this stamp. The FDA whole grain health claim also indicates that an item is whole grain rich. Again, this is not required, so if it's not on an item, it doesn't necessarily mean that the item is not whole grain. As we said earlier, changes for breakfast grains will not be required this school year, but some schools occasionally serve breakfast-type foods for lunch, so we will go over breakfast cereals. In order for a breakfast cereal to be considered whole grain, it must list a whole grain as the first ingredient, and the cereal must be enriched or fortified. Formulated grain fruit products are grain products that are highly fortified that were previously approved by USDA to be creditable as both a fruit and a grain. An example would be something like a highly fortified donut that previously was creditable as both a grain and a fruit. Effective school year 2012-2013, formulated grain fruit products can no longer be credited as a fruit, but they can still be credited as a grain. Keep in mind that some of these products tend to be high in calories and/or saturated fat and may contribute to the menu exceeding the calorie or saturated fat limits, which we will go over in a later presentation. CN labeling will be updated to reflect the whole grain rich requirements for the new meal regulations. During the transition, you may still see both the older and newer CN labels. If a CN label indicates that a product contains a specific amount of bread or bread alternate, this means that it meets the previous requirement for breads and grains. If the CN label indicates that the product contains ounce equivalents of grains, this means that the product meets the whole grain rich criteria. The last bullet on the slide gives you the location of a website you can go to for more information on CN labeling. We're going to conclude with some summary questions for you to review. This slide lists ingredients for a white whole grain steak roll. Take a few minutes to review the ingredients and think about whether or not this is a whole grain rich item. If you answered yes, that this is a whole grain rich item, you are correct. It is a whole grain rich item because the first ingredient is a whole grain. This slide lists ingredients for a wheat club roll. Take a few minutes to review the ingredients and think about whether or not this is a whole grain rich item. If you said no, this is not a whole grain rich item, you are correct because the first ingredient, bleached enriched wheat flour, is not a whole grain. One last example, a multi-grain roll. This one's a little tricky. Is this a whole grain rich food? It is possible that this product is whole grain rich, but more information is needed. As stated earlier in the presentation, an item can be considered whole grain rich if the total weight of whole grain ingredients exceeds the weight of grain ingredients that are not whole grain. Or, stated another way, if at least 50% of the grain weight is whole grain. Ingredients are always listed in order of weight, with the ingredient that weighs the most listed first. Although the first ingredient which weighs the most is not a whole grain, there are several whole grains in the product: ground whole wheat, oatmeal, and whole rye. So it is possible that the total weight of the whole grain ingredients is greater than the weight of the grain ingredients that are not whole grain. To determine whether or not this item is whole grain rich, check with the manufacturer. Or you can check for other identifiers for whole grains such as the whole grain stamp or whole grain health claim. If you have questions about the content of this presentation, please contact the Pennsylvania Department of Education, Division of Food and Nutrition. Contact information can be found on this slide. Funding for this presentation has been provided by a 2011 Team Nutrition Training Grant from the United States Department of Agriculture.